Hello, this is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College. Before we get into talking about the PowerPoints for our book, the 7th edition of Web Development and Design Foundations with HTML5 by Terry Felk Morris, I'm going to give you a couple, or maybe three, we'll call them pre-presentations, all right, or intro presentations on what we'll be talking about in here. Now, some of the stuff that I mentioned, maybe most of the stuff that I mentioned in here, won't make a boatload of sense to you. All right, but these are presentations that I've created. Okay, so I'm just going to start. All right. As mentioned in here, this class is going to concentrate on three different elements. The first is HTML5, and that will be a lot of the class. Probably somewhere in the area of 50 to 60%. And then probably about all that's left, except for about 10% of it, will be on CSS3, and then maybe 10% of the class will be on JavaScript. All right? But we have to be able to understand HTML5. HTML is an acronym that stands for Hypertext Markup Language. All right? And what happened was somewhere in the area of about 5 to 10 years ago, probably closer to 10 years ago, maybe even a little more than that, different groups got together and said, we had this product that people used in the 90s that was called HTML that didn't do everything we wanted it to do, so we were going to replace it with something else, like maybe XML, all right, which is another acronym which stands for the Extensible Markup Language. But then they said, XML is kind of hard, so let's kind of navigate our way from, let's have a kind of a combination of HTML and XML, and let's call it XHTML. So you see that there. So again, two different groups were getting together and decided that maybe HTML needed a facelift and we needed a new HTML. So these two organizations, and you can click on any of the hyperlinks that are in here, but they're the World Wide Web Consortium, which is the W3C, and what's called WATG, which is the Web Hypertext Application Technology Working Group. So they came up with two different specs for how we were going to be working with a new version of HTML called HTML5. They did agree on things, and eventually they started to merge together. As it says here, the goal was that web pages would be easier, period, whether you were a user or whether you were a developer. All right? As they started to do this, the mobile web markets, it was starting to explode. Tablets and cell phones were getting more and more popular as for use in web pages. So web development must allow for an easy integration with a mobile web market. And the idea, as it says right here, was to future-proof a website, was to make it easier, so that when older versions of browser disappeared, there was very little of what was going to have to be done. All right. Now, what we'll end up doing in class is we'll end up creating some templates. All right. And all of the stuff that's in here, by and large, will be discussed in class. I do want to mention one thing, and that is what you see here. This is called an HTML5 shiv, S-H-I-V as in victory. And basically what it said was what we're doing here is if somebody is using an earlier version of Internet Explorer, so something that's less than IE9, and if you come across one of these new HTML5 tags and you don't understand what it is, then either just disregard it or just basically look at it as though it's some kind of a text box when you don't know what something in there is. All right? So there's a little bit more in here, but this line here is another line. that says, you know what, if we want to be able to work with a web page, there's a good chance we're going to need to use a jQuery, a JavaScript library named jQuery. So go out to the internet and find the newest version, which isn't 1.8.3 anymore, but whatever, and just bring it to us. That's what that's saying. All right, so let's, like I said, let's break these lines here down. The first line says Doctype HTML. Back in the olden days, before HTML5, you had a very long Doctype statement because it had to say whether or not you were going to be using a strict Doctype, a transitional Doctype, or a frameset Doctype. The difference between these is if you used a transitional Doctype, then any of the HTML tags that have been obsoleted, or as we refer to them, deprecated for HTML5, all right, couldn't be used if it was strict. If it was transitional, that's the opposite. You could use them. And if it was frame set, you couldn't use them except for anything that worked with frames. Do you have to worry about that? Not at all. All right. The idea is that's all been replaced with this. And even though it doesn't matter which of these you use, you can make them upper, lower, or mixed case, by and large, what you'll find is every single tag that you see in HTML is all lowercase. So I'm going to use it like this. All right, the next line that's in there says HTML lang equals en. Okay, this is an attribute. It's the HTML tag, and it has an attribute inside, which is the language or lang attribute. And it says it's recommended here that we put this in here and we say that the language we're using is English. Now it says recommended though not mandatory. Really, the system supposes that you're going to put it in, and it's just good practice to do so. Then you've got the head section. Back in the olden days, before HTML5, you put all this stuff in there. Again, we don't have to worry about it now. What this basically says, for lack of better words, is that we're using a character set that's a universal transformation format, 8 characters. If that's too much for you, we're using what's called the Unicode character set. Why? Because it supports approximately 100,000 plus characters. All right, which will handle any language that's on the earth right now. This, again, as we talked about, is this HTML shiv. If you want more on it, you can click the hyperlink and find out more. All right. Now, a couple things that are on this. I'm going to click a couple of the hyperlinks that are on this page. It says if you don't use a Doctype, so if you don't have that line in here, what happens is the system does not know that it's supposed to use what's called standards mode. So it uses what's called quirks mode, which basically says, well, I know there might be problems in here. So the bottom line is, if you want to do things the right way, you'll put in a Doctype. Now, I do want to click on these 2 links. This first one here is very interesting. It's called caniuse.com. And what it does is you can look up any CSS, HTML5, or SVG, which is scalar vector graphics, any JavaScript API type of thing. So let's say I wanted to know, okay, the CSS animation, for example. If I click on here, what it says is IE. It's not supported in IE8 or below. It's supported in Edge, which is, I think, IE11. It's, etc. So you can see the different versions of something and where it's supported and where it's not. Some of the stuff is you work your way through here. Well, I'm trying to pick out one that's going to look a lot different. So, So if you notice in here, how this is almost all red, which means that these SVG fonts aren't supported by most. They're not supported by most browsers. Why? Because again, it's something that's been deprecated over time. So it's a very interesting site. It's just called caniuse.com. There's another one here that's called Dive into HTML5.info. Now, this is a little bit dated. It's probably 4 or 5 years old, but it's an online book that has virtually everything you could think of for HTML5 in it. It's all hyperlinked. So if I go here, boom, I can just work my way through here. And it's very well done. All right. So notice you can still use old stuff if you want to. So for instance, you can still use the BR with a slash on the end, the input or the HR with a slash on the end, but there's no reason to do that. All right. This is a big one. This may not sound very big, but prior to HTML5, HTML was very case sensitive. It's not anymore. But it still is recommended that you use lowercase for all of your tags. All right. It used to be you had to say things like disabled equals true or clicked, checked equals checked, but now you can just do it like this. This is, when I say here are some recommendations, these are things that I recommend. All right. First, establish some kind of a standard that you're going to use when you write your HTML and stick to it. I've said this before and it almost sounds funny, but even a bad standard is better than no standard at all. I recommend, again, you use lowercase for everything you do. And I recommend that you always close elements. All right, the system may or may not complain if you leave off an ending tag like this, but you should put it in anyway because it's just the right thing to do. Omit the trailing slash from BR tags, HR tags, etc. Don't do this. Checked equal checked. Do this. Always use quotes for attributes. And there's an example of an attribute there and there. And I'd recommend double quotes, not single quotes. Again, HTML5 is all about semantics. The idea is you are supposed to be able to look at HTML5 and immediately by the look and feel of the tags that are in there, have a better idea as to their meaning. Now, what I put in here are all sorts of, and this is a little dated. I created this presentation a few years ago. But if you want more on HTML5 semantics, what semantics are, what the new elements are, you can go through there and start taking a look at it. These are some of the major new tags. And you'll notice that all of these link to the same place, and that is HTML5 Doctor. All right. I like this site because it explains what the element is. It gives an example of how you use it, and it shows it basically in the confines of a complete document, most of the time at least. So again, header, section, article, nav, I'm not going to run through those. I would suggest strongly that you go through all these and take a look at them. It may or may not make a lot of sense the first time you go through them. That's okay. The goal here is to be able to apply all this stuff. All right? So the old classic div ID equal header has been replaced with header. All right, sections are generic sections of a document or an application. Articles are articles. Nav is typically going to be used for wrapping up an unordered list of links. So in other words, it's going to be for your navigation that's at either the top of the page or down the side of the page. Aside is literally for that. It's maybe you've seen this. Let's assume, okay, it wasn't that long ago we had the unfortunate shootings in Orlando. And let's assume that the next day you buy a newspaper. I know there are still some newspapers out there, but you buy a newspaper. And it's got a big article, okay, on the shooter and what happened in there. But then along the side, maybe on the left-hand side or the right-hand side, there's another article that talks about the shooter, either the shooter's earlier life or maybe one of the victims. That's an aside. It typically was called a sidebar back in the days of newspapers. And a footer, whereas a header is usually stuff at the top, a footer is usually stuff at the bottom. Now, if you click this example, I think this is, yeah, that's it for this presentation. This is an example, so it says, let's see a real life example, all right? So I'm going to show you two of them. Here's one. Okay, and what's in here? Well, notice. Come on. Don't know why it's not showing. But this should actually start, and this should actually show you this. Notice how the stuff is moving here. You can have that guy move. You know, some bells and whistles and stuff that's in here. Again, I'm still not sure why that one's not moving, but it's not. All right. That is from this book that's right here. It's called HTML5 and CSS3 for the Real World. Will mention one more thing before I finish this presentation, that if you go out to the site that's called it-ebooks.info, there are literally hundreds of books that are out there. All right, I'm going to type in here HTML5 and CSS3 in the real world. And no, it doesn't look like that's one of the books. Yep, it is there. So if you want that book, you can go out to the site and then just click on the button that says download, and it'll show you how to build that site that I just showed you. All right, here's another example. This is a tutorial that's from IBM, and it's about 35 pages or so long. But, you know, people say, well, should I go do this? Should I run through the steps that are in there? And, you know, I'm not telling you what to do. But the more practice you have with this, the better off you're going to be. I'm not sure why it's not showing, but it's not. All right. So, that's it for this first presentation. And I'm going to come back in just a second with a second presentation. All right, so I'll be back with that very shortly.